What if I told you that the woman who once called Louis Farrakhan a dangerous anti-Semite is now starting to sound just like him? This isn't just about politics, it's about how power, truth, and influence can twist in ways nobody saw coming. In the mid-1990s, few figures stirred as much debate in Black America as Louis Farrakhan. Known for his fiery speeches and sharp intellect, Farrakhan was far more than just a powerful voice. He was a strategist and Despite leading a relatively small religious group, the Nation of Islam, he managed to accomplish something unprecedented: the Million Man March. On October 16, 1995, over 1 million black men converged on Washington, D.C. in a massive display of unity and purpose. The event sent ripples through the country and caught the attention and concern of government officials. But the government wasn't the only group watching closely. The Jewish community was uneasy as well. Farrakhan had long been criticized for remarks widely viewed as Then, in early 1996, he embarked on what he called a world friendship tour, which raised even more eyebrows. Between January and March, he visited 7 nations, 4 of which sparked particular alarm: Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Sudan. At the time, all 4 were Muslim-majority countries under heavy U.S. sanctions, often labeled adversaries of both Washington and Tel Aviv. The optics were clear. A man accused of anti-Semitism was now building ties with nations equally hostile toward Israel. Just a few months later, on April 4, 1996, Farrakhan faced veteran journalist Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. The interview became one of the most charged and unforgettable moments in the show's history. There, Farrakhan was pressed directly about his views on Jewish people, a question that would define much of how the public remembered him.
Friends will say, "Wallace, come on, we've heard all this before. He's not to be trusted." You know that.
Well, that's on both sides.
I know it.
That's on both sides. I could say, well, we've heard that before too, of reconciliation. Look at the Indians, look at all the treaties that were signed, and look at where they are. So let's not talk about trust, because I really don't think that you've earned.
In the 1990s, being labeled anti-Semitic carried serious consequences. Reputations could crumble overnight. Yet Louis Farrakhan managed to weather that storm. His deep connection with the black community offered him a kind of protection that few others had. To many of his supporters, his controversial remarks were secondary to the empowerment and pride he inspired. As a result, Farrakhan continued to thrive, even under pressure from the U.S. government and amid threats to his safety. Fast forward to 2018, the world had changed. The rise of social media reshaped how influence worked, and the old rules no longer applied. Public scrutiny had gone digital, and accountability now came in real time. In this new era, Farrakhan once again found himself under fire, this time not from political leaders or journalists, but from a young woman who publicly challenged him on national television.
We're seeing take place on the left is that a form of extremism is starting to take place. You can't even get me started on Al Sharpton. I mean, as a black American, I fundamentally take great issue with a lot of the things that he's done here. We're talking about a man that has frauded the black community over the last 40 years, now taking a platform and telling us that we should be aligning ourselves with Louis Farrakhan, who is a known anti-Semite. And this is the same platform on the left that they tell us that we should be worried about Trump because he's racist, because he's sexist, because he's literally Hitler, their favorite thing to say. And yet they align themselves with somebody who is a known anti-Semite. Just consider that for a second.
The young woman in question was Candace Owens, a bold and increasingly influential voice within the modern conservative movement. Owens's rise to prominence was nothing short of meteoric. Within just a few years, she had gone from being a relative unknown to a central figure in right-wing media. Praised for her sharp rhetoric and unapologetic criticism of liberal politics, she quickly became a favorite among conservative circles for her articulate defense of free markets, traditional values, and individual responsibility, messages that resonated with a generation of young conservatives eager for fresh, relatable leadership. At this point in her career, Owens was closely aligned with Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, TPUSA, a nonprofit organization that focused on mobilizing young conservatives across college campuses. Turning Point USA's mission was to counter what it perceived as the liberal dominance in higher education, encouraging students to champion capitalism, patriotism, and limited government. The organization's influence grew rapidly, supported by a network of high-profile conservative donors, many of whom were Jewish Americans. This financial connection is significant because it would later become an ironic twist in Owens's public evolution. At that time, she fully embraced the conservative establishment's messaging, including its firm rejection of anyone labeled as anti-Semitic or extremist. To criticize Israel or express sympathy for controversial figures like Louis Farrakhan was seen as political suicide in those circles. Owens knew this, and she followed the script faithfully. But history has a way of testing convictions. As Owens's fame grew, so did her exposure to criticism and complexity. She was no longer simply echoing the talking points of her peers. She was beginning to encounter the deeper ideological debates that underpinned global politics, issues of race, religion, and power that were far older and messier than any partisan line could neatly explain. And that's where Louis Farrakhan's name resurfaced. For decades, Farrakhan had been one of the most controversial figures in American public life, a man both revered and reviled. As the leader of the Nation of Islam, he inspired millions with his messages of black pride, self-sufficiency, and resistance against systemic oppression. Yet, at the same time, he was condemned for statements widely interpreted as Many in both Jewish and mainstream American communities viewed him as a dangerous figure who perpetuated hatred and division. So when Farrakhan's name entered the public conversation once again, the question naturally followed: was he truly anti-Semitic, or had history misunderstood him? Critics didn't have to look far for examples. One of the most cited pieces of evidence came from a sermon he delivered called "Who Are the Real Children of Israel?", a speech that opened with a jarring and fiery declaration. Farrakhan's message was direct, defiant, and laced with the rhetorical power that had made him a magnetic figure for decades. He questioned the legitimacy of certain Jewish claims to biblical heritage, suggesting that those who identified as Jews were not the chosen people described in Scripture. Instead, he argued that the true descendants of the Israelites were the oppressed black people of the world. To many listeners, especially within Jewish communities, this was deeply offensive. It wasn't simply a theological disagreement, it was perceived as an attempt to erase Jewish identity and justify hostility toward them. Farrakhan's choice of language, particularly his reference to the synagogue of Satan, a phrase taken from the Book of Revelation, amplified the controversy. His detractors saw it as proof of religious animosity. His defenders claimed it was symbolic, a critique of corruption and hypocrisy rather than an attack on Judaism itself. For Owens, who had been raised politically within conservative institutions that were staunchly this type of rhetoric was the ultimate red line. At least, that's what she had been taught to believe. Within conservative circles, especially those aligned with evangelical Christianity, Israel wasn't just another foreign ally. It was sacred ground, a nation viewed as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a moral outpost in a turbulent region. Supporting Israel was a kind of ideological litmus test, and criticizing it could immediately brand someone as anti-Semitic. But the more Owens learned and engaged with different communities, the more she began to question what she had been told. The social media era gave rise to a new wave of decentralized information, where narratives once controlled by major institutions could now be challenged by independent voices. Black activists, Palestinian advocates, and even dissident Jews began using digital platforms to share historical documents, alternative interpretations, and critiques of global power structures. Owens found herself confronted with perspectives she had never encountered in mainstream conservative spaces. This growing awareness, combined with her own inclination toward contrarian thought, began to create friction between her and the establishment that had once embraced her. As she examined issues like media control, international conflict, and the economics of influence, she noticed recurring themes that echoed what Farrakhan had been saying for decades, albeit in his own provocative and sometimes inflammatory language. Still, Owens was cautious. She didn't openly endorse Farrakhan, nor did she claim to follow his teachings. But subtle shifts appeared in her tone. Her critiques of Israel's actions in Palestine became more vocal. She began questioning why certain topics were treated as untouchable, why some forms of oppression were condemned loudly while others were ignored. To her critics, this sounded like a dangerous slide toward conspiracy thinking. To her supporters, it was a sign of intellectual independence. Meanwhile, Farrakhan's sermon, "Who Are the Real Children of Israel?" continued to be dissected and debated long after its initial delivery. Scholars, journalists, and theologians analyzed its implications, not just as a piece of religious rhetoric, but as a reflection of a larger historical tension between Black and Jewish communities in America. The relationship between the two groups had once been grounded in shared struggles for civil rights and justice. Yet, over time, Political realignments and differing cultural priorities created rifts that leaders like Farrakhan exposed and, critics argued, exploited. When Owens's name entered that discussion, it symbolized a generational shift. She represented a new kind of political influencer, one shaped by the algorithms of social media, rather than by traditional political institutions. Unlike Farrakhan, whose influence grew through physical gatherings, sermons, and newspapers, Owens operated in a digital age of viral clips and online debates. Her words could reach millions in seconds, but they could also be weaponized against her just as quickly. And so, when she began echoing certain points that resembled Farrakhan's critiques, especially those concerning power, identity, and global politics, it reignited an old cultural firestorm. Was she brave for challenging sacred narratives, or reckless for touching one of the most sensitive topics in Western discourse? The answer depends on who you ask. But what's undeniable is that Candace Owens' encounter, even indirectly, with Louis Farrakhan's legacy highlights a fascinating crossroads in American thought. It's the intersection where faith, race, politics, and truth all collide. Farrakhan, for all his controversies, represented a long tradition of Black intellectual resistance, one that questioned who holds power and why. Owens, though emerging from a very different ideological background, found herself slowly, perhaps unintentionally, walking into the same conversation, whether she intended to or not. Her evolving stance forced both her audience and her critics to confront uncomfortable questions. Who decides what's off-limits to discuss? Who benefits from labeling certain figures untouchable? And most importantly, how much of our worldview is truly our own, and how much has simply been inherited from the systems we claim to challenge?
The issue of white supremacy has never been brought to the table to be discussed. The architecture of white supremacy will have to be exposed so the tree of white supremacy can die and the tree of humanity can live. Who are the draftsmen and the architects of such an idea that has dominated our planet for the last 4,000 years?
The publication in question would go on to become one of the most hotly debated and divisive works in modern Black American history, a text that, for many, stood at the crossroads of empowerment, controversy, and pain. It wasn't merely a book, it was a statement, a challenge to the established historical record, and an open confrontation with one of the most sensitive subjects in both African American and Jewish relations. Its first volume, published in 1991, sent shockwaves through academic and religious circles. The book asserted that Jewish merchants and financiers had played a dominant role in the transatlantic slave trade, a claim that flew directly in the face of mainstream historical understanding. According to the authors, Jewish involvement in the slave trade was not marginal, but substantial, central even to the economic systems that enabled slavery to flourish across the Atlantic world. For supporters of the publication, this argument was presented as an attempt to tell the truth, to highlight aspects of history they felt had been suppressed or sanitized. For critics, however, it was a reckless distortion of historical fact that threatened to undermine decades of progress between Black and Jewish communities. Mainstream historians, including many Jewish and non-Jewish scholars alike, strongly disputed the book's claims, presenting detailed research that showed the transatlantic slave trade was driven by European colonial powers and multinational economic interests, not any one ethnic or religious group. Still, the impact was immediate and electric. Within Black intellectual spaces, particularly those aligned with the Nation of Islam, the book was embraced as a powerful act of historical reclamation. To many readers, it represented a form of counterhistory, a way of seizing control of the narrative about who profited from centuries of Black suffering. In the early 1990s, when discussions of racial inequality, economic exploitation, and historical accountability were rising again to national prominence, this publication found a receptive audience eager to question conventional wisdom. The controversy surrounding the first volume set the stage for what was to come. The second installment in the series expanded its focus from slavery to the Reconstruction and post-emancipation eras. This time, the book claimed that after the abolition of slavery, Jewish business owners, landlords, and financiers had effectively taken control of the Black American economy. The authors argued that as formerly enslaved people sought independence and stability, they often found themselves economically trapped, renting land, borrowing money, or buying goods from merchants who, according to the book, exploited their limited opportunities. The tone of this volume was not just historical but moralistic. It painted a picture of betrayal. That one historically oppressed group had allegedly profited from the continued oppression of another. Critics, however, accused the work of falling into dangerous patterns of scapegoating. Jewish organizations, scholars, and civil rights activists condemned the volume for pitting minorities against one another and for feeding old stereotypes about Jewish greed and control. The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, and other advocacy groups warned that the book's rhetoric could stoke anti-Semitic sentiment and unravel the hard-earned alliances built during the civil rights movement but within some corners of the Black community, especially among those who felt alienated from mainstream political discourse. The book's themes struck a chord. To them, it was less about assigning blame and more about understanding power, who had it, how it was used, and how it had historically intersected with race. The series spoke to long-standing feelings of economic disenfranchisement and mistrust toward institutions seen as benefiting others while keeping African Americans at the margins. Then came Volume 3, perhaps the most peculiar and provocative of all. This edition focused on the Leo Frank case, an early 20th century legal drama that had already been dissected extensively by historians. Leo Frank, a Jewish factory superintendent in Georgia, had been convicted in 1913 of murdering a young girl named Mary Fagan. His conviction, widely believed to be unjust, led to a national outcry, a commutation of his death sentence, and ultimately his lynching by an anti-Semitic mob in 1915. The case had become a cornerstone of Jewish American identity, a symbol of persecution and the dangers of prejudice. For the book's authors to revisit the Leo Frank case in the context of Black-Jewish relations was seen by many as inflammatory. They suggested that the media attention and national sympathy Frank received were evidence of the privilege afforded to Jewish victims over Black ones, who were lynched by the thousands with little to no outcry. Critics accused the writers of manipulating the case to serve a divisive racial agenda. Supporters countered that the intent was not to deny Frank's victim, but to expose the broader hypocrisy of a society that could rally for one man's injustice while remaining silent on the suffering of millions of others. The inclusion of the Leo Frank case marked a shift in the series' tone. It moved from historical analysis to cultural critique, challenging narratives of moral superiority and victimhood that had long shaped American memory. It forced readers to confront uncomfortable questions about whose suffering gets remembered, whose pain is validated, and whose stories are conveniently forgotten. Of course, this approach came at a heavy cost. The entire series was widely condemned across academic, political, and religious lines. It was labeled deeply not only for its conclusions but also for its framing. Its tendency to attribute collective guilt to a religious group and to revive conspiratorial ideas about economic control. Many Jewish scholars pointed out that such narratives echoed the very propaganda that had fueled centuries of persecution, from medieval Europe to Nazi Germany. And yet, despite or perhaps because of the outrage, the book series gained immense visibility. Copies circulated in churches, bookstores, and community centers. Debates about it filled radio shows and opinion columns. Even those who despised its arguments couldn't ignore its reach. For a generation of readers, particularly within militant or nationalist movements, it became a symbol of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to accept that history is written by those in power. What made the controversy even more complex was that it reignited older wounds between Black and Jewish Americans, two communities that had historically shared both struggle and solidarity. During the Civil Rights era, Jewish activists had marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and risked their lives in the South to help register Black voters. But by the 1980s and 1990s, those alliances had frayed, strained by competing political priorities and mutual misunderstandings. This book, whether intentionally or not, reopened those divisions, forcing both sides to confront how fragile their relationship had become. In the years since its release, the series has continued to haunt discussions of race, power, and identity. Supporters defend it as a challenge to historical orthodoxy, a necessary disruption of a sanitized narrative. Detractors continue to cite it as a textbook example of how misinformation and prejudice can masquerade as scholarship. What cannot be denied, however, is its influence. Few works have provoked such intense reactions across so many communities or sparked as many conversations about who gets to write history and whose truths are allowed to stand. Ultimately, the publication's legacy lies not only in its claims but in the emotions it unleashed: anger, pride, defensiveness, curiosity. It exposed the fragility of racial alliances and the deep human need to find meaning in collective suffering. Whether one views it as a dangerous distortion or a courageous revelation, one fact remains. The controversy surrounding it forced America to reckon once again with the uncomfortable intersections of race, religion, and power, the very tensions that continue to shape its cultural landscape today.
Our historical research department has studied from the scholarship of Jewish historians, scholars, and rabbis. And we have published volume number 2 of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews.
Louis Farrakhan was known for using fierce, often biblical language when speaking about Jewish people. One of his most cited phrases was the synagogue of Satan, a term borrowed from scripture. In his interpretation, those who carried out what he described as evil or exploitative acts while claiming Jewish identity were, in his view, not true Jews but agents of corruption, followers of the devil, rather than of God. Farrakhan often linked this belief to early Christian writings about persecution and moral struggle. He was among the first public figures to openly take this stance long before voices like Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes echoed similar sentiments. Over time, Owens herself began to distance from groups such as Turning Point USA and commentators like Ben Shapiro of the Daily Wire. As her political views evolved, she began to express skepticism toward Israel's actions in Palestine, framing her criticisms in increasingly extreme and controversial ways.
I hope everybody recognizes that, like, when it all comes down, they'll kill you too. Like, I just want to just, like, it's just, when you get to the point where you have to, like, start saying that it's, like, cool for, like, innocent babies and children to die, and you're like, well, I'm in the crowd that's saying it, so my innocent children and babies won't die. No, that's not really how it works. When you get to the level of I will kill a child and lie about it, you're at the level where I'll kill anybody and lie about it. Like, there's a bigger thing happening here. So don't think you're, like, marked safe by being a sellout and pretending like you don't think that, babies dying is wrong. Just want to let you know, you die too. Maybe they kill you last, but you're dying too.
During a live stream, a viewer once asked Candace Owens a simple question. Could you interview Louis Farrakhan? He's in his 90s. Owens paused, admitting she knew very little about him. When she entered politics, she explained, she was told never to speak about Farrakhan, never even to learn about him, because he was, in her words, a raging anti-Semite. She believed that without question. Why would people say it if it weren't true? She reasoned, noting that those warnings came from individuals within her own conservative circles. So, when Owens was directly asked to engage with Farrakhan, she repeated what she had always been told, that he was someone to avoid. Yet, over time, something began to shift. Candace Owens started to find herself aligning with several of Farrakhan's viewpoints, particularly regarding Jewish influence and the State of Israel, though she never publicly declared that Farrakhan was right. Her evolving statements suggested that she had begun to see parts of the world through a similar lens in the earlier stages of her career. Owens often positioned herself against Black activists and leaders, using that contrast to build a name within conservative media. But as years passed, her rhetoric began to change. She started questioning institutions she once defended and echoing arguments similar to those she had once criticized. While she never issued an apology or direct reversal, her alignment with certain Farrakhan talking points hinted at a quiet reconsideration. The inspiration for this discussion came from a content creator known as The Real Dana, whose video titled Candace Owens Admits She Was Wrong About Louis Farrakhan highlighted this very contradiction. It raised a bigger question. If she was wrong about Farrakhan, what else might she be wrong about? As people mature, they often realize that long-held beliefs don't always align with real-world experience. Many, like Candace Owens, were taught that success meant distancing themselves from Black identity and community. Yet, as Owens questions conservative narratives, contradictions emerge, especially when she agrees with Farrakhan on some issues while ignoring his critiques of white supremacy. To confront that truth would risk her platform, so she carefully avoids it. For me, authenticity matters more than approval. I lean right, but I stand with my people. Perhaps Owens' shift simply reflects a growing awareness that reality isn't so black-and-white. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support, and as always, hit that bell subscribe, and stay tuned.